afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Android developer interview. Today we are fortunate enough to be joined by the good folks from Pocket Gems. We've got Arjun and Jeff from the Pocket Gems team here today to talk a little bit about their products and their experience developing on Android. In particular, they're going to share a little bit about their experience in defragging the Android developer, or defragging Android development, I should say. So we do these developer interviews hopefully regularly, so we'd really appreciate your feedback to find out what we could be doing differently, how we could be making this a better experience for you guys. So Arjun, do you want to tell us a little bit about Pocket Gems and what you're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rachel. So Jeff and I are here today from Pocket Gems. We're really excited to be at Google, and we wanted to, really the purpose of this is to share all of the knowledge that we've learned over the past year with our Android development and give any developer out there tips and tricks on how they can optimize their development and get the best user experience out there. So let's get started. So the title of our talk is entitled Defragging Your Android Development. And essentially, we called it defragging your development because, there's this notion that there's a lot of fragmentation on Android, and we hear this a lot from, developers that we work with. And we really wanted to kind of debunk some of the myths and talk about some of the tips and tricks that we've learned to make that process much easier. So so my name is Arjun Dayal. I'm the product lead of Android at Pocket Gems. I come from a computer science background, got my degree at MIT, and before this I worked on Xbox Kinect.
And I'm Jeff DeCue. I did robotics at Olin College of Engineering, and then went and worked for Blue Origin, an aerospace company, as a software developer before I moved down to Pocket Gems.
Great. So for those of you that don't know a whole lot about Pocket Gems, we were founded in 2009, and we are a mobile gaming company on both iOS and Android. So we currently have 14 titles. We're a Sequoia-backed company, and essentially, we've been a pioneer in the free-to-play mobile game space. So we had the first farm game, we had the first store game, we had the first hotel game, and very recently we also pioneered the first exploration simulation game. And so, what makes us really excited about Android and why we're giving this talk is because just the numbers have just been really ridiculously amazing. And so if you were at GDC, what you saw was the stats that said there's more than 300 million activations to date on Android. There's more than 850,000 new activations per day, and there's already over 1 billion app installs per month. And now with the the new Google Play system, it's essentially you've got a one-stop shop for all of your entertainment experiences. It makes it a lot easier as a developer for you to get the right experience to the right users. So bottom line, it's a huge opportunity for you as a developer, and the market is just really exciting right now. So for Pocket Gems in particular, we currently have 4 titles on Android with plans for many, many more to come. And so we have Tapsu currently, which was the #1 grossing iOS game in 2011, along with 2 of our latest titles, Tappily Ever After, and the one that is an Android exclusive right now, Tap Safari. And so this is just the start for us. We're really excited about the growth of Android and the growth of the market itself, and we're looking forward to putting more games out exclusively on Android. So I wanted to jump into a couple of things that are really important about game development. And the first one, as a developer, which I'm sure you've realized, is that making games isn't as easy as you might think it is at the start. So not only do you have to have a killer game concept, intuitive UI, and engaging art, you also have to decide between, do you want to have a paid app or would you like to use in-app purchase? And then, thinking about the future, you want to think about what all the back-end services are to scale to the millions of users that you're going to have when your game is, a hit. But not only do you have to consider those things, but there's also things that you might have forgotten about. And so essentially the things that you might forget about are memory and performance and the different devices and what you should prioritize as being your focal points, as well as regions and locale. And so all of these combined should be taken into account when you're thinking about your Android game development and in order to create a successful experience.
And so I'm going to give a couple of tips on basically some things that we've learned and jump right into that. The first thing is it's important to pick the right set of devices that you want to really tailor your game to. And I guess taking a step back, what Android really provides is an opportunity to, with a single development process, reach a huge variety of devices. the Android platform is so diverse and so great. But you can't just hit publish and get a game to work on every single device. It does take a little work, and you got to step through it. And so what we suggest is pick a few devices that you really want to focus your QA on and do most of your testing on. And picking those devices definitely comes down to who are the users that you're most interested in, demographics of people who have those devices, and there's a ton of information available online about the breadth and the adoption of particular devices that can help you make those decisions. But it's important to keep in mind that there are times when you just won't be able to support every device, and often it's better to just leave a device off your approved list rather than give people a subpar experience. Next thing is just the screen resolution. It can really, it's a tricky issue, but there are really high-res phones and tablets and low-res phones as well, and you definitely want to do everything you can to support all those. But sometimes it's important to just restrict your app so that it only goes out to the devices that you have had time to develop for so far. But keeping in mind that you always want to go back and make sure as many users as possible have access to your application. One thing that we found particularly interesting is that you can't just focus on the pixel resolution of a device, because there are 10-inch tablets and 4-inch phones that have exactly the same screen resolution. And that can cause a pretty jarring difference for users if you're writing your code to just pay attention to those pixels. So definitely know those limits and keep that in mind when you're developing your apps. For us at PocketGems, taking advantage of our tools has been really important. I mean, obviously, having scripted builds is sort of a no-brainer in software development, but it's been really important for us, especially when we're interacting with our QA team, to make sure that any build that they're doing tests on has been produced using a very reliable process. We use a continuous integration system to make sure that we're always getting the same results every time we turn out a build. And we don't do any QA work on builds that are produced from an IDE. We use the IDE builds solely for the development iteration before we call a feature complete. And another great tool that we've really latched onto is called Roboelectric. It's an open source tool that it's a testing framework for Android that really makes testing so much easier. It makes unit testing and integration testing just a breeze, and we've used it to speed up our development process really significantly. Another great thing that we have is we've added a cheat menu to our games so that our QA teams have the ability to jump through the game so that they can make sure that when we have a bug or a problem later in the game, they can jump right to it and they don't have to play through the whole game every time. It's also a good way to sort of experiment with new features. One of the other great things. No, this is you.
Great. So, one of the problems that's actually classic Android that we'd like to illustrate here is, once you essentially finished creating your game and you're ready to put it through a real rigorous testing schedule and make sure that it's ready to go out, you'll classically fall into this problem where you say, okay, I have 1,000 devices. Which are the devices that I should prioritize, and what are actually the operating systems that I want to make sure that I have, a really polished experience on? And so the way that we think about this at PocketGems is essentially in this matrix view. And so in a sense, you'll see for example, we've got some devices on the left-hand side, the Galaxy Ace, the Droid X, the Galaxy Nexus, and these might be things that, again, we've identified as target devices for our app to go out on. And it could be based on, GPU, it could be based on memory, it could be based on, CPU cycles, but essentially we've picked and prioritized the device list that we want. And then at that point, we know that each of these devices runs on a number of different operating systems. So if we wanted to be 100% certain that we were, going to have an amazing experience on every single device and every configuration, what we would do is start to check off each one of these boxes and spend time performing a full test pass on the Galaxy Ace with 2.1, 2.2, 4.0, 4.03. Same thing with, say the LG Optimus, going through this entire thing. But as you can realize, when this is only 5 or 6 devices, when you start to expand this out to between 10 and 20 devices, it becomes a solution that you don't have enough time essentially to QA your device on all of these. So really, what I'd like to propose and how we think about this is instead of feeling that like you have to perform a full QA pass on everything, make sure that you have coverage across every operating system and across every device that you care about. And you can prioritize these a little different based on how you view the importance of each device. But in this case, if you'll see, we'd like to test the Galaxy Ace on 2.1. We'd like to test the Galaxy Nexus on the latest 4.03. And now, in this sense, we have testing across every one of our devices that we care about and across, every operating system that it could that we also care about. And so what you'll see here is, again, you're not performing the full complete QA pass over all these, but this is, from a risk perspective, a great way to think about, optimizing your time, and especially if you don't have, if you have limited resources. So another way to think about this is that after you've shipped your app out, you should really be using the data and the analytics that you're receiving from Google or your own collection to refine your process. So in this case, if I find that once I release, I'm making 90% of my revenue from 4.0 devices and maybe the Galaxy Tab on 3.1, then it's completely fine to go back and alter your QA process and say, instead of testing on 2.1 and 2.2 anymore, I'm really going to focus all my efforts on 4.0 devices for all these to make sure that I have a 100% success rate in terms of the experience going out. So again, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, but it's completely okay to go and refine these afterwards for your specific needs. So now, again, when you're thinking about QA, a lot of people are asking, well, do I run a full test pass and everything? Like, what does that actually mean? Do I run a more broad test, which is what we would call a compatibility test? And so for us, from the matrix, if you remember, we would perform a full test pass on a select number of devices. And so that might be the Galaxy Nexus on 4.03 and the Galaxy Tab on 3.0. But we would also perform a compatibility test, which essentially touches every feature, but doesn't go nearly into the depth that a full test pass would. So, a compatibility test for us would take maybe minutes for each device instead of the hours that it takes you to perform a full test pass and make sure every single scenario and every quest and every feature is 100% polished. And again, I would think about prioritizing what to run based on the most popular devices, either for your game or in the market if you haven't shipped that out. It's also important to remember that it's okay to test to the deltas. So when you're trying to be very agile in Android, Android has this great ability that when you publish your app, it goes live immediately. And so you do have the ability to say, okay, if I've made a targeted change to maybe just 1 or 2 sections of the code, you don't need to go back and run maybe a full test pass across all of your device suite. But what you could do is run a targeted test pass to just the areas of the code that you identify that you have deltas in. And essentially how we think about this is it's all about risk from a risk perspective. You're going to ship out builds to your users. You want to have the highest confidence that what you're shipping out is the highest quality so that your users have a great experience. But with the limited time and resources that as a developer you're going to have, it's really important to prioritize effectively and reduce the risk as much as possible.
Yeah. Personally, one of the things that is most fun about being a developer at Pocket Gems is just the ability to work in this really tight feedback loop between QA and the developers. We're all in the same area and we all get to talk, all the time. And it's just a really important part of how we make the games better is just every time we make a feature change, we're having a discussion about how that improves the gameplay and the flow. And QA is always there to keep us honest. But that's just the build process, and when we release and transition into live ops is when we start sort of opening up the doors for the whole second part of the process, which is where we take the crash reports and the analytics and the data that we're collecting from our users playing the games and what they're enjoying, and we start to take that and feed that back into both our development process and our QA process to improve both, so that overall our build process just gets significantly better. And that's a really important point in the development phase of a project, is where you transition to all of a sudden having this broad and really rich set of data about what your users are doing. The way that we do that most is by taking advantage of anytime there is a crash or an error on a device. We make sure we report as much data as we can back to our servers so that we can really grind through that data. We, of course, whenever there's a crash, we want a stack trace of where in the code path the application was, but we also have info stacks, which give us more content, data about what was actually being processed when the error occurred. And that's a really, really valuable thing, especially when you're running through the same code in tons of different ways. But and on our servers we have automatic deobfuscation, which is just really powerful for us, time-saving wise. We have the ability to report in our crash reports the last 50 lines of log data that we push to our log, and that's just a really great way to get the context of what generally was the application up to, even if what are the crashes that are happening most often. And that's a really important thing for us as a development team and a management, from a management perspective, just figuring out what is the top priority. But sometimes, you end up with a crash that you don't have all the information for, and you have to make a choice at that point. Are you going to move on as a team and just live with that crash for a while until maybe you just kind of stumble upon a solution, or what we end up having to do more often is add to the instrumentation that your application provides, add new features into your crash reports. A lot of the features that you've seen here, because of that kind of an iteration, we needed better tools. And so, a lot of the time you just have to put that investment in. But I would say one of the greatest things is utilizing customers. The customers who go out of their way to post on a forum or to give a review they've already shown that interest in your game, and they're there, and they are often so responsive and so helpful, and the dialogue and the depth of detail you can get is just really incredible, both for the developers and especially for the QA team in finding reproducible bugs. Another trick that we've got in our games is we have sort of a tiered experience where if you are a developer building in your IDE, or if you're running tests on the code directly, the game, anytime it runs across an unusual situation, something that we flagged as important, it'll crash. And that's really important, that the developers don't get to sort of live with a mild bug like that. They sort of are halted in their steps, and they go and they fix it as soon as possible. Then the second tier is when we have our QA team testing. It would be great if we could just crash, but they need to actually get their testing done. So instead, we pop up a dialogue in the game, and we say, hey, here's the problem that happened. File a bug, let the dev team know, and that's just really, really helpful for us as a dev team to be able to call those things out. But for users, they don't care that a bug happened. They just want to keep playing the game. So we don't interrupt them at all, but we do send ourselves a crash report to allow us to debug that in the future, and especially marked as something that the user is able to continue from. And so that's our tiered system that's worked out really well for us.
Great. So one final thing we'd like to touch on is just the potential of Android as a new ice cream sandwich continues to be pushed out into the market, and a lot of people are adopting it. Because personally, as Pocket Gems, we're looking at these features and get really excited about the potential for a lot of these new areas, and including Android Beam and resizable widgets, and just the depth at which the Google Plus integration is happening. It really is something that as a company and as a developer, you should continue to look out for, because in the next couple of months, that kind of these 4.0 functionality and features will get rolled out to more customers. So you definitely want to be ahead of that curve and make sure that you're able to put out an amazing app to lots of different customers that's differentiated. Great. So that's we hope you really enjoyed the tips and tricks that we've learned over the last year. We've been really happy to come to Google and give this talk and go for some questions.
Absolutely. So thanks a lot, guys. That was really interesting. I think quite helpful to get a bit of insight as to how other development teams go about the process of developing for Android. So we've opened it up to you guys. So if you are watching this Hangout, and if you are in the Android developers circles, you should be able to join us. So check your stream. We've also got a moderator link, which we've posted out a couple of times today. So if you do have a question you'd like to share, please pop it in there, and or join us live in the Hangout. And we'd love to hear your questions. In the meantime, I've put together a couple of questions for you guys to kick us off. So you talked a little bit about this within your presentation, but how did you guys decide which of those devices are the most important? So you said you focus on the one from each version plus the ones which are important to you. How do you figure that out?
Yeah, that's a great question. And essentially, we started with just market data, and this was when we were just new to the market and Android development as well. We looked up the stats and saw, hey, some of the Galaxy phones and some of the Motorola Droids have a significant market share. And so we knew that for our games, our philosophy is to push out our experiences to everyone, and in a sense we want to have the largest target audience possible. So we started there with that kind of device set, and then we refined it over time as we'd push out apps and we'd see where our games were working well on devices, where they weren't going well, and so we've had like a year's worth of experience refining that and coming down to a set that we feel really comfortable with.
Cool. And how often do you feel that you need to go back and sort of revise that list?
Yeah, it's an interesting time because you'll see like HTC and Samsung and all these handset makers are releasing so many things at every quarter, and so it's definitely advantageous to you to keep up on a lot of that news, and you'll start to see there's a lot of sites out there that track Android phone usage and trends, and so say something for right now like the Galaxy S2 is something that's very popular and is risen quickly over the last couple months. So just keeping track of the market, using the stats that Google provides you as well, because you'll see like what's the most popular device type and what's the most popular operating system. That's a great way to keep track of it.
Nice. So you mentioned that you've got your own crash reporting system, which is impressive. So I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into that if possible. How can you talk a little bit about the implementation side of that? How do you provide that sort of multi-tier level of being able to have users continue to do their thing and still do crash reports?
Yeah, so a lot of that is we've built a lot of utilities inside the client, inside the application what we always want to do is make sure that in an unexpected case, if we do run across one of those code paths, we want to figure out a way to recover safely. So if that's returning null or returning an empty object instead of one that actually has the functionality you need, that's the kind of decision you make when you're developing that. But we have built in just the utilities to say throw an exception if you're testing, and it's all nicely wrapped up so that really you just have to make that first step as a developer. Yes, this is one of those points where I do want to throw an exception if send a crash report if I'm a user. So that's that's how that happens. On the server side, it's sort of a lot simpler, or in terms of there's a lot less decision making every time we get a crash report. We sort of run through it, see if it fits and matches with any of the other ones we have. If it does, we put that into a group. Otherwise, we leave it as an individual report.
So it's really right from the design perspective, right at the beginning, and you have to build that right into your app. Like if you're going to throw an exception, it's not good enough to just print it out in the logs and move on and die. You really need to figure out how can it continue even after this unexpected case has occurred.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we try and start with that philosophy every time we add a new feature.
Yeah, it's really important because on the other hand, you will still get crash reports where you don't have enough information, and so at that point you make a decision. You say, how much time do I want to spend investigating this, or can I get actionable repro steps in a sense on it? But the other way that you can think about it is, okay, well, now that I have a crash that I think I know the area that it's in, you can go back and add some more log lines or instrumentation to those to get better data for the next actual build that you ship out. So it's an evolving process, and even we find areas of the system where we want to get more information about it. So it's a continuously evolving process for us.
Very cool. Very interesting. So given that you have your own crash reporting system, do you still take advantage of the things which you get provided by the system, like the Android crash reports on the developer console?
Yeah, we do, and that's why it's great, because with the prioritization of the Android data itself, it helps us also, it's another data point in terms of we see our own crash groups and we see what's impacting our users, but it's just like a second point of validation on, yes, this is the crash that we should really go spend our time on. Because you might be getting hundreds of crashes a day from obscure devices that you didn't even know your app was going to. And at that point, it becomes, you could spend months going back and trying to track down all these crashes. So you really have to have a very explicit prioritization system. So we use the Google data from the dashboard heavily in conjunction with our own data.
Very cool. And you mentioned using the data in the developer console as well to be able to do that post-launch prioritization of where you want to focus your time and attention. We had the developer console engineers on a couple of times over the last few months talking about their plans for the future and, well, talking about trying to get information from you guys as to what they should be planning.
Yeah.
So they've had a few launches since then. I'm curious from real-world developers, how have you found that transition? Do you like the new version of the dev console, and what would you say some of the most useful elements of it?
Yeah, I think we've definitely been very happy with how that's been evolving over time. And for a while we didn't have a ton of information there. You would see some of the crash reports and stack traces, but now that you have info on largest carrier and things like countries and how your app compares to like the average, say, casual app in the market, it's great data that before we didn't really have access to, and we would kind of be guessing, oh, I think we're overweight in one area versus another. But when you can actually see that data and start to use it in your feature creation, it helps out a lot.
Very cool. So we've been focusing a lot on how you report things when things go wrong. Do you use analytics to report on when things go right? And so what kind of degree do you use analytics within your applications, or within your games?
Yeah, I think that's great. And PocketJams, our philosophy is we're a very analytical company. We like to make almost all of our decisions based on data, and not intuition gets you probably 85% of the way there, but then you need that extra data validation to make sure that you're doing the right things. So we certainly we're heavily instrument all of our events, and so we know what things people are buying, where they're getting stock, things like retention and monetization and engagement stats, and we use those very heavily to understand how to tune our games and how to make them better for all of our users out there.
Pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, Google's very much the same. It's very sort of analytical-driven company where you try and get as much data to base your decisions on as possible. So, yeah. So, in terms of, we've talked a little bit about how you choose what devices you want to focus on. Obviously, a big thing for us these days is tablets. Trying to get developers to seize the opportunity there and really optimize the experience for tablets. Is that something that's on the radar for you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that one of the things that we've been focusing on most recently is making sure that our games run and look really crisp on the high-res screens, and just building up. It's one thing to handle a couple of different aspect ratios for some devices that are all about 4 to 5 inches, but when you, or 3 to 5 inches, but when you start scaling up to the huge tablet displays, it really does require a lot more thought of how is the game going to play when all of a sudden the buttons are 3 times as big. as your finger. And the taking care and figuring out strategies of actually taking into account the physical width of how big something is going to be on the screen, rather than just the number of pixels, has been something that I think has started to show in our games and started to really improve the gameplay for all users. And in fact, one of the really great side effects of that is that the more we focus on those really high-res, large screens, we actually have been incidentally, and once we realize this, we really seize the opportunity, improving the experience for the really low-res phones, the really small devices, and that's actually been, I think, one of the highlights of our past few releases is really making that experience better for everyone.
Outstanding. So apart from sort of the conceptual leap to go, well, actually, this is something we need to look at and something we need to optimize for, how difficult has it been to sort of implement those changes, provide something custom for the different sorts of devices?
I think that actually with the native Android UI toolkit for our menus and things like that, it's just been really quite easy to start taking advantage of alternate layouts, things like that, to make the game work better in those different environments. But also for us, just thinking about new ways to do scaling and in-game, when we have the high art displays, that it's sort of a different problem, and figuring out how to build scaling into those screens from the start rather than doing it as an afterthought has it's actually gone very smoothly. I think once we made that decision to start paying close attention to scaling, we were able to tackle the problem pretty easily.
That's great. It seems a lot when I speak to developers, the issue isn't so much being able to do it, but just sort of realizing that you have to, particularly if you've got an office full of people just using standard phones, and then someone comes in with something really high res or a fancy new 10-inch tablet, and it's like, this doesn't look so good.
Yeah, and a lot of times what we do is we force ourselves to use different devices. So, I love my Galaxy Nexus, but I force myself to use a lower res device just to understand what the experience is, across the board. And you'll find funny things like, well, when you want to optimize for the high-res devices, then all of a sudden, the quality of your art needs to get a little bigger, which makes the image size larger, which then, translates to APK size getting larger. And so it's this, it's this balance that you really have to go through. But it really, at the end of the day, creates a better user experience. So it's something that we're really happy to continue doing.
Excellent. Yeah, it's funny. Like we do the same thing. Like we'll be testing games and apps, for partners and to give people feedback. And we're so used to using the same devices. I got my Galaxy Nexus and my Transformer Prime, and that's all I'll do it on. And then you sort of have to stop and realize actually a lot of people aren't using OCS. I should probably test it on a Gingerbread device just for fun. You mentioned the challenge with supporting more and more devices that your APK gets bigger and bigger. Are you guys still delivering things as a single APK, or have you started to make use of multi-APK for delivery?
Yeah, so for right now we're still using mainly just the one APK, but as ice cream sandwich functionality becomes more prevalent in the market, we're certainly looking at the idea of moving to multiple APKs. And you can imagine that we'll even have to adjust our QA philosophies and our prioritization, because now you're testing two APKs that might be 90% similar, but then again you have this custom functionality. So it's going to be interesting for us as we continue to move on with having multiple APKs, because that's the right solution ultimately, and we'll get to see how we have to modify our processes accordingly.
Excellent. So I'd be interested to touch a little bit on your testing and QA process, if possible. So how often do you do releases, and what's the process there in QAing and making sure that what you put out is really high quality?
Okay.
We aim for very frequent releases, every few weeks, or more often if possible. Wow. We do constant QA testing, test passes of our games. We always focus on, of course, the one for the QA side, whichever one we're doing the most development on, and we do try and sort of cycle through our games, not spend too much time looking at just one, but really make sure we're not leaving them behind. But I guess we always we work really closely with the QA team to make sure that they know exactly what we're changing and try and keeps their jobs much simpler if they know exactly what to look for, what might go wrong, what are the possible side effects, and that's definitely been our recipe for success. Is just as good communication there between the dev and QA teams as possible.
Yeah, I think as a company, our philosophy is really the day that we ship a game on day one. That's not the end for us. We're very committed to our users and devoted to adding new functionality and features regularly. And we found both on the iOS and Android side that our users really appreciate that. And so our game, if you look at TapZoo from day one versus TapZoo now, or Tap Safari or Tappily Ever After, you'll see that it goes through massive amounts of change that you might not expect from a mobile app developer, because a lot of times it's once you're done with the game, then let's move on to the next one. But we have a philosophy that once we push it out, we should also listen to our users and figure out what they want and where we can take the next leap.
Outstanding. I always love to speak to developers which take that approach of not just pushing it over the wall and then moving on to the next project, but really treating it as not as a service as such, but as a product which continues to live. People spend a lot of time and effort on apps and games, so it's useful for them. Useful for them to know that what they're doing is worthwhile for them. So the camera isn't switching, so we're going to take a slight camera adjustment. Let me help you out there. All right, I can get more comfortable.
Great.
For the last couple of minutes. All right, perfect. So yeah, like I said, it's great to hear that you guys take that approach of once it's out there, it's something you need to continue to support, and probably something I need to pay more attention to on the apps that I put out on the market, which don't always get quite as much love. So let's see. So are you releasing your titles? You're not an Android-only shop, right? You release titles on other smartphone platforms. Can you tell us a little bit about what's your release strategy for there? Do you prefer one platform over another, try and release at the same time? What's the thinking?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so, when the company was founded, the iOS platform was the most mature at the time, and so we, having limited resources, focused our efforts primarily on iOS. And so that's how we, grew our operations, and that's where, the majority of our time was spent. Mm-hmm. But, as Android has ramped up and has become an amazing market with a lot of opportunity, we've also shifted our resources and our efforts to creating not only things like simultaneous releases, but also looking at the potential of Android first and Android exclusive type launches. So as the market continues to evolve, we recognize that both markets are actually different, and you can't treat them the same. You can't necessarily push the exact same app out on both platforms and expect it to do well on both. So we're taking the approach of tailoring our experiences to the custom platforms.
That's interesting. Have you found that that's been effective? Producing slightly different versions, has that resulted in, without going into too much detail, but has that resulted in more relative revenue for than just trying to push out the same thing?
Yeah, it's interesting. And again, we take a very analytical approach to this. So we will try different features and different aspects on each platform, and we'll be able to see what the ROI is of that. So it's you can start as a developer, if you have an iOS game, it might be great to, if you wanted to move over to Android, start with feature parity. But then as you start to look at the data and see everything that's coming in, you'll realize that you will need to tune it and add custom features for your Android audience in order to potentially get the same or better return from it.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's something which we've been telling developers for a while, like your Android audience have different expectations.
Yeah.
I think particularly for development shops which have come from an iOS background or even a different smartphone background and have those devices, they are users of that platform, and so they have the same expectations. Whereas the vast majority of their audience hasn't had a different device or has chosen an Android device for a reason, right?
Right.
So there's definitely an advantage, I think, to really customizing your solution to something that your actual users will be happy with.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Let's see. We've got time for a couple more questions. I'm just having a look on the moderator. I don't think we've got anything there which is particularly is there anything there that you're inclined to answer? There's questions about competitors and revenue, which I don't think you guys will want to answer. Can you talk about how many developers that you've got? Or
Sure. So it's one of those things where our team evolves over time, and as we create more Android exclusives and more titles that are simultaneous launches. So it's not something that is ever static, and so we change that over time just based on where we want to put resources.
Sure.
The in-app purchase one, so the question is, how well has in-app purchase gone for Tapzu? As a company philosophy of ours is to have we follow the freemium model and not the paid model, because we really wanted to reduce that barrier to entry for everyone to come and try out our experience. Mm-hmm. And so for us, it has gone really well, and we don't have comparable data or to say like what would happen if Tapzu was a paid app or things like that, but it's just our company philosophy has been, let's get it out to the most amount of users as possible so that they can all enjoy it.
Sure, I guess that makes sense. Excellent. So let's have a look. So I don't think we've got any other questions come in. Let me just have a quick look on the G+ stream to see whether anyone has asked them there. No, what do you ask? What are you using for crash reporting? We've gone through that. Okay, so you can probably just about wrap up. What I am interested in, I don't know how much you can talk about it, but do you have more on the horizon for Android? Have we seen all that there is, or have you guys got more plans?
Yeah, so you certainly have not seen all that there is on Android from Pocket Gems just yet. We're excited to be working on another Android exclusive title that we'll be able to talk about in a couple of weeks, but we're excited that it's going to be an Android first.
That's great news, Android exclusive. So we'll definitely be looking forward to that, and we might get you guys on again, maybe to join us on the Friday review to talk about that once it's released.
Sounds great. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you both very much for joining us today and for the presentation. And hopefully we'll see you guys again shortly.
Great.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us. We do Android Developer Office Hours every Wednesday at 2, and we have the Friday review for 2 hours between 1 and 3 every Friday, and we'll hopefully be doing more of these developer interviews on Thursdays at 2 o'clock again. So if there are people who you would like to have behind the table on the hot seat, do let us know, and we will reach out to them and see if we can get them to come in and answer a few questions. So until then, thank you very much.